Our presenters today are Lindsay Gemmel and Matt Leahy.
Matt, Lindsay, JP, please go ahead and share your slide to get started. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
This is Lindsay speaking from CapTech. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I see we have a nice crowd here of about 100 of us. We're very excited to have this conversation with you about accessibility and keeping up with WCAG. So we're going to talk about WCAG 2.1 and what that process looks like from a few case studies at CapTech and how we implemented an approach to making sure that we are integrating the new additions to the WCAG body of contents to the work that we are producing. A quick intro for Matt and myself. I am an inclusive design manager at CapTech, and I have over 10 years of experience working as a multidisciplinary UX professional. I also have a background in front-end development as well. I'm certified from the IAP on both my CPAC and WAS. So accessibility has always been part of the decision-making process for me. And I'm very excited to work alongside someone who has a very similar background and mission as myself. A quick description of what I look like. I am a white female with long brown hair. I have clear glasses, and I'm currently wearing a pink t-shirt with a gray cardigan. And I will pass it to my co-presenter, Matt, to introduce himself.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Leahy. Like Lindsay said, we have a very similar background. I'm also an inclusive design manager at CapTech, also have my CPWA certification, have over 10 years of experience doing a variety of different roles, including UX UI design, front-end development, and working in digital accessibility. Description of myself, I am a white male in my mid-30s with a shaved head, short brown beard, wearing round glasses and a maroon button-down shirt. I'm very happy to be with you all. I'm going to hand back to Lindsay now to intro the presentation.
Thank you, Matt. This is Lindsay speaking. So just a little bit about CapTech very briefly. We are a consulting firm, and among many of our services, we design and develop websites as well as applications for companies and government agencies. We began targeting WCAG 2.1 AA in all of our delivery in 2019. So we wanted to talk to you today a little bit about the challenges that we encountered, the lessons that we learned, and the changes that we made along the way to really fine tune and start to develop a structure for how we implement this into our project process from start to finish.
This is Matt Leahy. I'll just jump in and add, as a consulting firm, CapTech has a really large staff of designers and developers with a wide range of exposure and knowledge about accessibility. We also have a wide range of makeups of our project teams, oftentimes even including designers and developers from our clients that are staffed alongside CapTech's designers and developers. So Lindsay and I work across a wide range of different types of projects and different teams, and the experiences we're going to talk to you about in this presentation are based on that broad range of experiences we've had.
This is Lindsay. I would like to kind of go into a little bit of an overview of WCAG 2.1 and what changed from 2.0 to 2.1. I know that recently your team has had WebAIM to come in and talk to you a little bit about what those changes are. But just for a refresher, or maybe those of you who might not have participated in that conversation. Want to walk through at a high level what to expect in 2.1. So you can see here that there is a long list of, this is part of the updates for 2.1. One thing to note here is that this became the standard in 2018. So if you remember, I had mentioned that we started implementing this into our process in about 2019. So it took us a little bit to jump into the process for, transitioning to 2.1. And I think that's a very normal approach to, these kinds of changes, thinking ahead to, that 2.2 is coming soon and what that will look like for that as well. So I think this is a great conversation to prepare us for that as well. But we have here some updates for low vision, things like reflow to support browser zooming, text spacing, non-text contrast, status messages, as well as things that address motor disabilities such as orientation, pointer gestures, pointer cancellation, motion acquisition, and target size, as well as things to look for cognitive and learning disabilities, such as identifying input purpose at both a AA and AAA levels, and as well as addressing timeouts. And then other miscellaneous updates were related to content on hover or focus, character key shortcuts, animation from interactions, label in a name, and concurrent input mechanisms. So there's quite a lot of variety here for what we're targeting from 2.0 to 2.1. And each project has had, various levels of integration for some of the things we'll list here, and we'll talk to those in our case studies momentarily. So to set up how we're going to take this journey together, what we've learned is that to successfully meet WCAG 2.1, conformance must be considered from the start of every project. It's important to have a solid foundation that incorporates accessibility into training and process, and teams should take a proactive approach to raise the bar and look beyond current WCAG requirements to prepare ourselves for what's to come, right? So baking that into the process from the very beginning has been very successful for us, and it was definitely a learning experience, a reflection, and how we get there and how early into a project this comes to fruition. And we will talk about that shortly. I will hand it over to Matt to go through our first case study.
Thank you, Lindsay. This is Matt Leahy. Like Lindsay mentioned, we are going to go through a few case studies now. On the slide we're showing currently that has that overview that Lindsay shared, and we are highlighting a few key themes, and each of the case studies that we talk about is going to cover those three key themes, incorporating accessibility from the start, building that solid foundation of accessibility and front-end training and process, and then finally looking beyond current WCAG requirements to sort of future-proof your approach. So we're going to start with that theme from the start. And the reason that this is so important is that WCAG 2.1 introduces several new criteria that fundamentally impact the design. They impact the design in such a way that if you don't account for those criteria early on in the design of your experience, it can be very, very difficult to address those criteria late in the process at the end of your development or during your testing stage, because it's going to require you to actually update or address the way the visual design of the experience works. It's not something that can just be addressed on the back end. And so that can create project delays because you have to reintroduce your design team and kind of circle back to the design of the experience at that late stage of your project timeline. That can have scope and budget implications because that is unplanned work. And finally, that can create challenges depending on how your teams are made up and allocated to project work when you have to bring in design resources again late in the process. On the slide here, in addition to the overview that I just covered, we also have listed at the bottom of the screen a handful of WCAG 2.1 criteria that fall into this category of criteria that fundamentally impact the design. So we're listing here 1.3.4 orientation, 1.4.10 reflow, 1.4.11 non-text contrast, 2.5.1 pointer gestures, and 2.5.4 motion actuation. All of these are criteria that, like I said, cannot just be addressed with backend code. They impact the design that users see on the front end of the experience. To call out one specific example here, pointer gestures. The pointer gestures criterion essentially requires that if you have functionality that is operated through complex or multi-point gestures, that there is a single-click alternative that an individual who isn't capable of performing those complex gestures can use to operate the same functionality. That criterion requires that that single-click alternative is built into the interface. If you don't account for that early on and you design an experience that is dependent on swiping, for example, it can be very, very difficult at that late stage of the project to revise the design, to revise the interface, to build in that single click alternative. It's going to be much more efficient and work out much more smoothly if those considerations can be addressed early in the process. So the first story that we're going to talk about here to illustrate this theme involves one of our clients that is a major US bank. And what we were working on for them was a customer engagement application that's displayed on both iPads and desktop computers in the bank's branches. The project team here was a team of CapTech designers, a blended development team that included developers from both CapTech as well as the client, and a blended accessibility team that included myself in an accessibility analyst role, as well as an accessibility team from the client. And in this story, we're going to focus on these two criteria, 1.4.10 reflow and 1.3.4 orientation. Just to quickly recap, what 1.4.10 requires is that all content and functionality can be scaled down to a viewport width of 320 pixels without horizontal scrolling to access any content or functionality. And what 1.3.4 orientation requires is that content is not locked into a specific orientation, specifically when we're thinking about devices like mobile phones or iPads that can be held in both a portrait or landscape orientation. We can't restrict to one or the other. We need to support both. So in this project, we were dealing with this customer engagement application. And one of the foundational challenges here was that this app, when it was originally designed and developed, was not approached with WCAG 2.1 requirements in mind. It was approached as an experience exclusively for desktop and iPad in landscape orientation specifically. And that was just based on the use case for how this tool was used by the client. It was never intended to be accessed on a mobile phone. It was always accessed within their bank branches, either on that desktop computer or on the iPads that they had in the branches. So because that was the use case, and because the team was not accounting for 2.1 criteria when this was originally created, there were not designs created for small viewports, and the app was not developed to reflow below that iPad landscape viewport size. And further, because it was the client's preference, the developers were actually directed to lock the app in that landscape orientation when it was viewed on iPad. And just compounding all of this, this will be a recurring theme throughout the presentation today. These WCAG 2.1 issues were not flagged until accessibility testing occurred late in the process after development was completed. Now, on the slide I'm showing now, I have a visual here of what the app looked like initially before accessibility testing and remediation, when it was viewed on desktop and zoomed to that 400% threshold that's required by 1.4.10. And what you can see in this screenshot is that the desktop navigation is essentially just compressed heavily down to fit the smaller viewport, and all navigation items can't be comfortably viewed without horizontal scrolling. There's actually a horizontal scroll bar here on the screen, and the user, if they had zoomed to this level, would have to scroll horizontally to view all of those navigation items. So the outcome of this process is that we had to meet the criterion, and we did. So the design team plugged back into the project, created new designs for the development team to reference to support those small viewports. And the developers reworked the CSS and created additional responsive breakpoints to achieve a fully responsive layout that could support all of those viewport sizes down to that 320 pixel size. So we got there, but there were definitely complications because, like we mentioned earlier, this was not accounted for at the beginning of the process. So first, the design team had already moved on from the project at this point. They had to be brought back on to support the development team in thinking through what the small screen treatment of the app should look like. The development team had to do some significant CSS rework at this stage of the process. There's an expectation when you go through testing and remediation that there will be revisions to be made, but the extent to which the CSS had to be reworked was not expected. Given those time constraints, the layout solutions that were used for small viewports were candidly selected more for ease of execution and the time that was available rather than the objectively optimal experience that we could potentially create for that screen size. And this delayed the project a bit. The project was required to cycle back through internal approval processes because we were actually introducing changes to the design. There's another visual on this screen that builds on the visual from the previous slide. This is showing the same part of the customer engagement application interface after remediation. So what we're looking at now is the customer engagement application zoomed in to that same 400% threshold, but the navigation is now reformatted into a vertical stacked kind of mobile style menu with collapsible sections that allows all content in that navigation to be viewed on that smaller viewport without the horizontal scrolling that we saw before. And so there are some lessons learned from this process. The biggest lesson learned here is that with 2.1 criteria specifically, because they do introduce some of these criteria that, like I said, fundamentally impact the design, accessibility can't just be approached as a development and testing consideration. It has to be something that's accounted for in the early stages of the process, including design. And in order to accommodate that in a scalable, reliable way, we have also begun ensuring that we are incorporating accessibility considerations into all of our project planning, requirements gathering, and all of those other stages of the process so that we can make sure that we are building in accessibility reviews where they're needed to the design process, that we are incorporating accessibility conversations and annotations into our handoffs to developers and all of those things so that we don't have surprises like we saw in this case study when we get to the stage of testing. And so ultimately, this creates less rework, which I think is something everybody wants to see. Team members are aware of WCAG requirements, and can proactively address them in their work. And it creates a better end product. I mentioned that, even though we were able to meet the criteria in this specific project, the solution is maybe not the same solution that we would have come up with if we had actually been approaching this problem from the beginning of the process. So doing this proactively allows the teams to come up with more thoughtful, more elegant solutions to all of these use cases. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Lindsay to talk through our next case study.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. This is Lindsay. So the next case study, as Matt had set us up earlier, is based on the second key lesson here, which is building a solid foundation for our projects and our process. So what we're going to look at here is really thinking about best practices from a UX perspective and kind of thinking with that lens for how this applies to 2.1. If you're following fundamental best practices for the products that we're building, most of these should come pretty fluidly and come out of that process. But there are times where we encountered situations where there was a lack of awareness of these fundamental principles. And as a result, the criteria that we're going to talk about here, we couldn't meet all of those as we uncovered during some of our testing. So this impacts a couple of different things. There are erroneous requirements that are communicated by design teams because they maybe didn't understand how they were conveying something could be interpreted to the team that they were talking to, or maybe they just weren't aware of the approach that they were taking impact on accessibility and 2.1 requirements. There's also increased time and effort spent on accessibility review and remediation because we're not thinking about this from the very beginning in those design phases. Again, this is one of those areas where it leans into the conversation that Matt was having, where the earlier you start thinking about this, the better. And the fundamental principles of how we approach the problem solving here will really help clear the way for making, meeting the criteria here easier. And then the last thing is mismatched expectations between design, development, and accessibility teams. This results in inefficient handoff and communication. So I want to talk a little bit about how we have taken an approach to the way we communicate between our different teams and ultimately improving that process for how we get a better end result. Before I get there, though, I did want to talk a little bit about the relevant WCAG 2.1 criteria overall to kind of the story that we're talking about here. So that's a 1.3.4 orientation, 1.3.5 identify input purpose, 1.4.10 reflow, 1.4.12 text spacing, and 2.5.2 pointer cancellation. And just to dive a little bit deeper into pointer cancellation, this one I think is probably the one that we don't run into as often, but when we do run into it, there is little awareness to what this is trying to solve. So pointer cancellation focuses on functionality that can be operated using a single pointer. And there are often times where potentially, a long click or a double click or some kind of alternate mechanism is required of a single pointer to perform a function, but then there's no alternative to work around that scenario or that workflow. And then that can break the accessibility of the experience. So we want to make sure that in those rare cases that this does occur, that we are making sure that if it's a must-have functional requirement, that we are providing an alternative way to meet that. And the best way to do that is, with that solid foundation and building that into the stream of thought from the beginning. So if we want to dive into the case study that we have here, this was a client for clinical assessment and caregiver support. And what we were doing for their team was building a full brand new website for them. We did wireframes as well as design and development. The project team was an internal CapTech design team, development team, and accessibility analyst. And we had different members of each team with varying levels of exposure to accessibility. So some of the design team had not familiarized themselves with 2.1. Some of the development team had not, familiarized themselves. But then we also had some members that were a little bit more well-versed. So it was a great way to not only talk about that approach and how we solve, for some of these accessibility concerns within our project team, but then start to pave a way for how we implement that in every process and how we onboard new folks into that process as well. So if we want to go ahead and talk about here what the biggest pain point here for meeting 2.1 in this particular layout was text spacing. So that's WCAG 1.4.12. And the short definition of meeting this requirement is that content implementing using markup languages supports the following text style properties. No loss of content or functionality occurs by setting appropriate text spacing in proportion to its size. So if we want to take a look at the example here, we were focused very heavily on this card layout in some of the component structures that we had. Our challenge here was that both design and development teams, again, had lacked awareness of the basic text spacing requirement. And the design team did a great job building a visual experience that the client loved and documented that as precisely as they could. But when they documented it, the development team took that as a very specific set of requirements and didn't mind that, there should be some fluidity in the layout to accommodate for things like reflow and resize and how that adapts to the different browser widths. So again, as a recurring theme, we did not pick up on this as something that would break our text spacing requirement until we got into the development phase, because in the design phase, in its flat implementation, there was nothing really that called attention to that this might be problematic. And as you can see, there's a visual here that shows an example of one of those cards with pixel markup for spacing and padding and the height of the specific element, as well as the spacing between elements. So there were very specific numbers associated with those things, and the development team actually took that to heart in a way that breaks the layout when we try to manipulate it slightly. So if we jump to our next screen here, I want to show you an example of kind of what that looked like. So the default presentation of the call to action cards on the left here, you can see there is a four grid experience with 2 cards in one column and 2 cards in another column that have that very specific spacing and padding that was documented in the design handoff file. But when we go to increase the text spacing properties, you can see that in the example on the right, the text starts to break outside of those cards. The grid itself stayed exactly the same because there was that fixed height that was applied from the design documentation into the development environment. And we are actually unable to even read some of those things because now we have white text on a white background because it broke out of that, that area. So simple things like documenting pixel values seem great in theory from a design to a development handoff, but there also needs to be that extra step of explanation for the fluidity and the responsiveness and how that behaves when it's manipulated. So just to touch base again on the outcome of, what we went through in this process is that we had to have the developers rework the CSS for the website to avoid any instances of fixed height. This was not the only area where fixed height was implemented, but it was definitely the one where, it was impacted the most because we had areas of very strict defined color that were then unable to be read when they were not fitting that experience that was originally designed. So once we removed the fixed height property, you can see on the example image on the right that now none of the cards seem to really appear to be the same height, but the content within is still legible. So one of the things that would have been really great to think about when doing documentation or when building these kinds of layouts is what happens when one gets larger than the other, and how do we document those things in a consistent way that not only keeps the design true to its original layout, but then works in an accessible way as well when we get into the development of this solution. So in this project, actually, the accessibility analysts had to also take time away from the review process to go back and meet with the design team and ensure that those requirements were understood and accounted for the rest of the layouts, because this was an iterative process where we did still have the design team during some of the review phase, and we were able to get them to kind of weigh in on what, you know, changes needed to be made here. But to Matt's point earlier, you know, if we were thinking about this from the beginning, maybe this isn't the quick fix solution that we would have come up with so late in the game. So there's definitely merit to not only using, you know, again, that approach to bringing it on earlier in the process and thinking about those things in the design environment and then the handoff phase, but using fundamental best practices to think through how you're implementing in the development phase the designs that you're given to make sure that these things can be accounted for and that we are given a seamless experience no matter how the design is affected on the front end. So if we want to jump to the next slide here. So the biggest lessons learned in this case study is that all team members should have a strong grasp of accessible front-end development. Since adopting 2.1, we've worked to build the technical knowledge of our design teams to ensure that they can make more accessible choices and provide the right direction to their developers. And we do this by providing annotations in the design phase where we can actually, you know, notate things that might not be intuitive from the start or from what the design is actually showing, and behaviors that are expected when, again, you have instances where spaces are manipulated beyond the default state and, you know, what that behavior should look like. At the same time, we've also placed emphasis on ensuring that our development team has a strong specialization in front-end development and responsive CSS layout to, again, think through those situations and test for them without having an accessibility analyst have to be the one to come in and test those things. We're always going to have someone that is, you know, able to do that, but we really want to encourage before it gets to that QA phase that they're testing for these things themselves in the browser before they're passing it off as a final product. The benefits of this are that we get fewer preventable issues, right? So the remediation process is more efficient and we can focus really more on the complexities and the, you know, dynamic content that is really more complicated and less on, again, those fundamental principles of responsive behavior, reflow, and elements that are normally expected to be tested for from the beginning that we were just originally missing the mark on. And then the other benefit is that we have more resilient layouts, right? Responsive design has always been a term that we've been throwing around for quite a while before accessibility became such an important part of our process. But using those principles to guide also our approach to accessibility it makes the end product more adaptable and easier to make content updates and things like that. So it's really been integral to our approach to work these principles into the process, just because, again, it makes the experience that much better. And I believe I'm going to pass it back to Matt. Yep, there we go for our final case study.
Hi, everyone. Matt Leahy speaking here for, like Lindsay said, our final case study. What we want to talk about here is taking a proactive approach to accessibility. One of the things that we learned through this process, moving from 2.0 to 2.1, is that when WCAG introduces new criteria, they are very often just formalizing accessibility techniques that were already considered best practice. They just weren't formalized in the recommendation as requirements. But we were sometimes very, very direct and specific with the way we approached accessibility, and issues that weren't specifically required for the targeted conformance level, which previously was 2.0, were dismissed or deprioritized. And so our teams did not get the experience and the learning related to some of those best practice techniques that now in a 2.1 scenario are actually requirements that we have to meet. So we lost that opportunity to, number one, create the best possible experience and incorporate some of those best practices, but also to prepare our teams for the transition to new WCAG versions in the future. And so as a result of this kind of closed-minded approach, or very, very overly specific approach to accessibility conformance, we ended up creating experiences at times that had a lower overall level of accessibility because we were only attempting to meet requirements. We weren't incorporating other best practices, above and beyond those requirements. It makes it harder to transition in the future. When new criteria are introduced, if you've already been practicing those things, you've already been exposed to those techniques as best practices, then adopting those new criteria becomes very, very easy. And if you don't do that, and you actually do, as we experienced on a few projects, have to learn those new criteria on the job in the middle of an ongoing project, it can lead to less efficient or less elegant solutions because you don't know the techniques going into it. You're learning them as you go. As we've done in the previous case studies, we're listing here just a few WCAG 2.1 criteria that are relevant to this theme. We've listed 1.3.5, identify input purpose, 1.4.11, non-text contrast, 1.4.12, text spacing, 2.5.3, label and name, and 4.1.3, status messages. Non-text contrast is a great example of this. 2.1 formalized contrast requirements for elements that were not text, but that's something we should have been doing anyway prior to 2.1. If we were really taking care and thinking proactively about accessibility, we should have been considering contrast for graphic elements, interactive controls, and things of that nature, and not just text. But WCAG 2.1 just formalized that as a requirement. So our final story here involves a national insurance provider that our team supported with a full website redesign and subsequent development. This was a fully CapTech team, so a CapTech design team, a CapTech development team, and an accessibility analyst from CapTech as well. And on the right side of the screen, we just have a screenshot of the homepage of this redesigned website that we created, showing a hero section with a couple of calls to action, as well as a left-hand navigation bar with a few navigation items displayed. The criteria that we're going to focus on breaking down this example is WCAG 4.1.3 status messages. What this criterion requires is that any essential status messages that update the user about important processes or important changes can be programmatically identified by assistive technology and then conveyed to the user without focus actually having to be shifted to that new content and disrupting the user in the flow of the activity that they were doing at that moment. And in keeping with the theme of this section, status messages was not introduced to or added to the ARIA specification when it became a 2.1 criterion. That was something that was a technique that should have been followed previously. 2.1 just formalized that as a requirement. So what we're looking at here is an example of the search functionality on this new website that we designed. We have a screenshot here of what the search results panel looks like on that new website. What we can see here is there's a search results, there's a search field with the search query climate entered in. And then we have a list of 14 search results displayed below in this screenshot. And this is just one example of dynamically updated content in the new website that to meet that criteria for status messages needed to be relayed to screen reader users. Because I should explain the way that this search functionality worked on this website, that list of search results actually dynamically updated as you typed into the search field. There was no form submission or other step like that that triggered this search results list to display. The challenge here is that the developers that were working on this project, like I mentioned before, had previously only worked on projects where there was very, very specific adherence to WCAG 2.0 criteria and really no application of additional best practices or accessibility techniques beyond those 2.0 criteria. And so as a result, some of these 2.1 criteria, like status messages, weren't accounted for in initial development. And then, as is a recurring theme here, if we take nothing else away from this presentation, it's that we should account for accessibility from the start. These violations were not flagged until accessibility testing occurred at the end of the process after development was completed. So ultimately, we were able to address the issue and remediate and meet this criterion. What we ended up doing was implementing these ARIA Live attributes into the markup to ensure that some of this dynamic content was announced to screen reader users. We have a visual of what that implementation looked like on the right side of the screen here. We're showing that same search results panel and search results list that I showed on the previous screen, but overlaid on top of that, I have a code example showing what the HTML for that section looked like, simplified for the purpose of this presentation. What we ended up doing was applying ARIA Live with a value of polite to the piece of text that specifies the number of search results being displayed. And we used a value of polite there so that that updated quantity was announced to the user when it made sense to do so in the announcement queue, and wasn't announcing essentially every time they typed a new character into the search field. So that ended up being a good implementation that met the need and worked well in testing. But because the developers weren't acquainted with 2.1 criteria prior to this process, and because they were essentially learning the ARIA Live specification on the job here, they had to dedicate time to that learning, and implementing this took longer than it really should have for a relatively simple solution. And just digging into that further, part of what added time and delay to this process is that the developers went through a couple of incorrect or flawed implementations of the ARIA Live attribute that we were using here. For example, when it was first submitted for review, it wasn't ARIA Live polite, it was ARIA Live equals true, which is not a valid value for this attribute. So we went through a few iterations like that, where the developers were learning how to implement this correctly. The accessibility analyst had to kind of dig in more than, or lean in more than they should have to support the developers in that learning. And ultimately, this was much less efficient than it should have been if the developers had that awareness going into this project. And so one of the learnings that we've had here, and something that we have really taken to heart as part of our overall approach to accessibility, is that WCAG conformance and the standard that we are required to meet for a project is just a baseline. It's a minimum. And we encourage our teams whenever possible to try to exceed that baseline. That includes our designers as well as our developers. So in addition to meeting those criteria for the required level of conformance, we also encourage them to familiarize themselves with AAA criteria, even though we don't typically try to meet AAA fully, that they familiarize themselves with future WCAG versions that are maybe not official yet, but in the planning stages, like WCAG 2.2. And so we do this in design, we do this in development, and we incorporate this into training as well. Lindsay and I do a lot of training for our team members, and when we do that, we kind of cover those bases. 2.1 criteria certainly, but looking beyond that to best practices as well. And that ultimately enables us to create better experiences with higher quality because we're incorporating things that are best practices, though not specifically required for our WCAG conformance level. And then, like I mentioned before, it makes it easier when we ultimately do need to transition to a new WCAG version and adopt those new criteria because we've built that familiarity. And yes, I did say WCAG 2.2 on that previous slide. If you're not familiar, you haven't heard, there is a new WCAG version that is very, very close to being officially released. The plan currently is still by the end of 2022, which, yes, is very, very soon here. This has been pushed back a couple of times. So we will see when this is ultimately made official. But I won't go through the full list here. But we've highlighted some of the key new criteria that are included in WCAG 2.2 on the screen here. There are some new criteria dealing with low vision, including defining some specific standards for how focus indicators are designed. In keeping with this theme for this section, that's something we probably should already be doing. In WCAG 2.2 is just formalizing that as a requirement. It's introducing some criteria to further help individuals with motor disabilities, including some criteria dealing with dragging movements, and actually introducing a AA criterion for target size, which is great. And finally, some additional criteria to help individuals with cognitive and learning disabilities and make experiences as intuitive and accessible to all users as possible. So just to wrap this up before we open up for questions, our big takeaways as an organization, having gone through this process and worked with WCAG 2.1 for a few years now, are that we have to consider accessibility and specifically WCAG conformance from the start of every project, including project planning, timelines, design stages, and everything in between. Well-constructed front-end code and flexible, responsive layouts are critical to meeting WCAG 2.1. And in fact, some of these criteria should be very straightforward to meet if you are following those general responsive front-end development best practices. And finally, whenever possible, we've learned to try to adopt a forward-looking approach and look ahead to things that may in the future become official criteria in new WCAG versions. So with that being said, we will stop here and open it up for questions. I believe we have some folks on the line monitoring the chat. we can take a look there as well. All right. So I see a question here from Rebecca. I'll read the question aloud for everybody. How did we approach training staff on WCAG 2.1? What format do the trainings take? That's a great question. I'll start, and Lindsay, please jump in. As I'm sure you all know, there are a variety of learning styles out there, and we try to accommodate those in the training that we do. What we try to do in our training is, number one, we cast a wide net. So we include individuals beyond just our design and development teams in a lot of our training to make sure that there's broad exposure to these requirements and best practices. Building on that, we do a lot of our training in sort of a classroom style format where we will have presentations, but we will try to be interactive and hands-on with those wherever we can. So where it makes sense to do so, we'll build in demonstrations, we'll build in kind of hands-on walkthroughs where in particular, if we're working with developers, we can maybe test a sample web page together to identify issues or those sorts of things. But in addition to those classroom kind of style trainings, we have tried to build in opportunities for people to train in sort of a self-guided way. So we encourage folks to take advantage of online training modules. In particular, DQ University has some great trainings that we like to direct folks to. WebAIM, who I know you all have worked with, have some great trainings available as well. So we try to complement the trainings that we specifically put together and deliver live with those sort of self-guided trainings that individuals can use to dig in at the pace that makes sense to them. And then finally, a lot of individuals learn best by doing, and they need the opportunity to practice and kind of see things, really in front of them and get their hands on them in order to build that knowledge. And so we've prepared activities for our teams as well for activities for some of these new criteria. So, to give an example, we put together something we call a tech challenge recently, where we have kind of a mock website that we put together that has some 2.1 issues intentionally built into it. And we have a designer and a developer work together to test, identify issues, and remediate issues, and then work with an accessibility analyst to essentially review their results and make sure that they caught and remediated everything correctly. So we try to cast a wide net with the approach and make sure that we give everybody an opportunity to learn in the way that works best for them.
This is Lindsay. There is one other thing that I would add to that Matt did not mention, is that we also do demos called Accessibility in the Wild, where we'll invite anyone who wants to attend to listen to a screen reader go through a site, and then we'll also call attention to the accessibility concerns that we find in that process and talk through how we would remediate them with folks in the room, give them an opportunity to take a chance at resolving it on the fly, and take kind of an iterative approach that way as well. So I think that that's a pretty broad approach to how we train: pre-recorded sessions, live sessions, demo days, and then tactical hands-on courses and trainings.
Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. This is Matt Leahy again. I'm going to pick out Tatiana's question. It's a great one. Tatiana said, what kind of disability demands text spacing? It's a great question. It's a handful of different disabilities that benefit from this criteria. Low vision, for sure, as well as reading disabilities and other conditions like that, where individuals may have the need to kind of modify the way that text content is presented to make it as comfortably readable as possible. It's worth noting as well with this tech spacing requirement that there is both a AA and a AAA criteria that deals with this. The AA criteria doesn't necessarily demand that you meet any of these specific text spacing values in the default presentation of the site. It just requires that a user through a plugin or other assistive technology can modify that text spacing and the site not break or become unusable when they do so. But the AAA criteria actually specifically requires certain values for line height and paragraph spacing and those sorts of things to make sure that the default appearance of the site is as readable to the widest range of people as possible as well. All right. Next question. Tony asked, assuming your team develops software using Agile, is the process taught to your BAs? If your BAs build wireframes, the standard can be included. Great point. We mentioned earlier, we've got quite a large team here that works with a wide variety of clients and a wide variety of processes, and we tend to adapt our process to the needs of the project and the client. So a lot of our projects are Agile, some are not. But to address the question, yes, we try to, whenever possible, include our BAs and other folks that are involved in defining requirements, involved in managing these projects, involved in testing, whatever it might be, in accessibility training, and make sure that they have that knowledge as well. Because, as Tony mentioned, when BAs if they're creating wireframes, yeah, we absolutely want to account for these things at that early stage. And we can annotate a lot of these things as well at that early stage. And then, in a similar vein, when we are, writing acceptance criteria for, things that developers are creating, we can include accessibility requirements there as well. So it's important that BAs have that knowledge. I think we are right at time here.
Matt, this is Rita Larson, and there's one question which I think several people would like to get an answer to. It's, what is the best software would you recommend for the developers to use to make sure code complies with WCAG 2.1?
It's a great question. There are a variety out there. I would say our favorite is Axe by DQ. Axe includes both a browser extension that you can use to run automated and guided tests in browser to identify issues. It also includes the ability to build checks into the development workflow using the same rules engine that the browser plugin does to check for accessibility issues in code. So Axe is the one I would recommend. Lindsay, would you add would you add anything to that?
The only other one I would say that we've used frequently or more frequently than others. I see a couple popping into the chat here. I'm not familiar with JetBrains or Axe, so I'm not sure if you are, Matt, but it's AXE by DQ. Yeah, there we go. I think is what you're getting at there. But is Lighthouse by Google. They also have a quick accessibility check, but I would say Axe by DQ is a much more technical view of the solutions and will give you a much better detailed report even for remediation of those issues. So that's usually where we tend to go when we do automated testing, as well as Site Improve, but that's a very much more robust platform. And DQ has just a browser plugin, so it's much easier to put into like your workflow, just the inspector tab for developers. So that's usually where we lean.
And thank you to everyone who clarified the spelling in the chat.
Thank you.
AXE. And thank you to those who provided links as well. Very much appreciate it. Rita, do we have time for more questions?
Yes, we have time for several more questions. It's okay. 11:02 and we go until about 11:25.
Wonderful. All right. I'm just looking through the chat here to pick out some additional questions. So Jane asked a question following up on Tony's question about incorporating accessibility into Agile process. And Jane's question was, do you also have a design system so that everything you build starts with accessible branded components? Yes, with an asterisk, I would say. We're working with a broad range of different clients and designing within the brand systems of those clients. So we don't have one design system that we use, but we do work with clients certainly on building design systems. And to your question, Jane, when we are working with clients on design systems, which is something we highly recommend whenever possible, because it allows us to build in accessibility from the start into those core components, as well as accounting for a number of other non-accessibility considerations as well. So yes, when we talked earlier about how we've learned to bake accessibility into really every stage of the process that we can, that includes design systems. One of the things that, to be honest, we still have room to improve, but it is absolutely something we are working on, is actually getting our creative directors and our design review process to adequately account for accessibility and include questions like, how would a keyboard-only user interact with this thing that you've designed? Bake those sorts of questions into the design process, so that even when we don't have an accessibility analyst on the project, somebody like Lindsay or myself, which is the majority of our projects, that we're still asking those questions and accounting for those things.
All right, Matt, this is Rita, and I'd like to remind everyone the chat is to be used for questions only, not comments.
Thank you, Rita.
And then we have quite a few questions, but a couple that are coming up is there are questions about what the BAs do, but what is the role of the project manager in regards to accessibility?
It's a great question. Lindsay, do you want to take this one? I feel like I've hogged a lot of the questions.
This is Lindsay. Sure, Matt, I will happily answer this question. So as we alluded to earlier, we have a very varying degree of staffing for our projects. So sometimes our project managers are BAs, and they'll be a little bit more hands-on because they're doing that requirements gathering and they're making sure that they're calling attention to accessibility concerns in that process. Other times our project managers are simply there for oversight and process and deadlines and those kinds of things. And they're really just making sure that those conversations are happening. So they're planning with the accessibility team to make sure that they're in the room with the right people at the right time, but they're not really getting in and doing any QA or testing or things like that. So it really, again, with that, it depends in the consulting world on the dynamic of the team structure that we have. But to Matt's earlier point, that's why we cast that wide net when we do our training and want to make sure that even if you're not currently staffed on a project here, that requires you to know that your next engagement, you might have to. So we are very flexible and adaptable in our roles on our projects here. And sometimes as a project manager, it will definitely overlap to have, this knowledge will be important.
And I'll just build on that and say that one of the sort of foundational issues that we ran into repeatedly, again, working with such a large team where we can't have oversight on everything, is projects that just weren't planned with the right steps and the right roles involved. We had projects where perhaps there were we were developing a front-end interface that really needed to have accessibility as a consideration, and maybe we actually didn't have somebody with accessibility testing capabilities on the project, or we've gotten I think smarter about what steps we need to include in the design process for accessibility. Lindsay mentioned annotations earlier. We found that to be a really effective way to kind of bridge the gap between design and development, and make sure that our designers are communicating, their intent for the accessible experience, beyond just what is in the visual mockups. But that has to be accounted for. There has to be time accounted for that in the project timeline, and those sorts of things, weren't happening either. And we've learned, what those steps need to be, and have worked a lot with our project managers and the folks who are kind of creating the plan for these projects to make sure that we're asking the right questions and incorporating the right steps so that we don't have surprises at the end like we shared examples of in some of these case studies.
This is Lindsay. Matt, that kind of actually leads into one of the questions that I'm seeing here in the chat from Jenny is, can you speak to how you budget and account for time and team and project timelines, depending on the level of experience of the team members? So those that are familiar with 2.1 versus those who are less familiar, what is that process like? And I think you were kind of getting there.
Yeah. So I think, like Lindsay said, to reiterate, the first thing that we have to get right is that we have the right steps in the process. As far as timing for project timelines, I think when we're working with clients, we can't add time to a project when we're working with a client, because we know that we have folks on the team that are learning 2.1. I think the approach that we've taken is to make sure that we know when we have projects where we're developing something that has a front end interface where accessibility is needed, and that we have the right people staffed on the project. So even if we have maybe a more junior developer that is still learning their front end skills, they're paired with a much more senior developer that has that knowledge. And so we are set up for success to address those requirements within the timeframes that we would normally expect to deliver on for our clients. I'm looking at the chat to see if we have other questions. I feel like we might have covered everything. Rita, are there any questions that we missed?
There was one question about, do you have a design system so that everything you build starts with accessible branded components?
We did address that one earlier.
Oh, you did address that one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, but I am wondering, have you ever worked on accessible documents? And if you've had issues with 2.1 in regards to accessible documents?
It's a great question. I will say we work with documents a lot less frequently than websites, but we have had that experience. To be honest, I think a lot of the same considerations apply there when it comes to how some of these considerations impact the design of that material. The same best practices that we've talked about here apply. Really, I think with document accessibility, the methods for implementing and for testing vary, but the broad concepts and the approach, I think, are very much the same.
Are there any other questions from any of the attendants? All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. We really want your feedback, so expect an email with a link to a quick survey. And even if you answered the survey following the introductory sessions, please respond. We have an option to check if your previous answers are unchanged. We want to know any concerns you have about possibly adding 2.1 criteria to the state accessibility standard and what you need in order to be ready should we add 2.1 criteria to the state accessibility standard. And would also like, if you haven't done it already, to subscribe to the Office of Accessibility newsletter. You can text hashtag MN or 66486. You can send a text with MNIT space A11Y. You will then receive an ENMN text alerts reply stop to cancel. You'll get tips on digital accessibility, announcement of new resources, stories about current projects of all types, and upcoming events and training. Thank you very much.
This is Jay Ryan. Again, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Lindsay, for coming here. We really appreciate hearing your stories, and we really are thankful for the time you took to prepare for this and the wonderful presentation, and we're looking forward to getting feedback on this. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us. We really appreciate it.
This is Lindsay. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye-bye. Have a great day, everyone.